Welcome to a webinar presented by museumexpert.org. The post-COVID museum, we've survived, now what? I'm Barry Van Diemen. I'm going to be the moderator for the webinar today, and I would like to introduce our panelists who are going to speak, and I'm going to do that in alphabetical order. Kirsten Ellenbogen is President and CEO of the Great Lakes Science Center in Cleveland. Perhaps our panelists should just raise their hand a little bit and and say hi to our guests. Cindy Foley is Executive Assistant Director and Director of Learning and Experience at the Columbus Museum of Art. Christian Greer is President and CEO of the Michigan Science Center. Catherine Horn, President and CEO of Discovery Place in Charlotte, North Carolina. Bert Vescalani is the President and CEO of the Denver Zoological Foundation, and Joseph Wisney, President and CEO of Roto. Welcome to our panelists. I want to start with a few pieces of information for our guests today. There's going to be a recorded version of this webinar, and that'll be made available to you through the museumexpert.org newsletter and sent out to everybody who's registered today as a guest. We'd love to hear from you both today during the webinar. You can use the chat and you can ask questions in the chat. We won't have time to get to all of your questions, but I encourage you to ask them and we'll follow up with you. If you have comments, you can add those as well. I want to acknowledge and thank the National Girls Collaborative Project for being our webinar host today, and all of the staff and team members of museumexpert.org, which is a volunteer organization. And they're doing great work of connecting both people who are on the website with organizations that are also on the website. Please check it out if you're not already signed up. With that, I would like to remind everybody that we are going to take turns, but at times I'm going to invite all these panelists to jump in with comment on particular questions. We have a lot of panelists for a lot of questions today, and I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak. But let me start with you, Catherine. It's been a really tough year, as we all know, with COVID and also with social justice issues, as well as science issues that, you know, the disbelief in facts. I want to know, in the midst of this pandemic, with witnessing the killing of Black people by police, by the COVID, and the closing of museums and other issues, how did you think about this and managing your way as an organization through the pandemic?
Well, good afternoon or good morning to all of our participants and our attendees. Barry, I think that's a really thoughtful question because it's we had so much reactive work in the beginning, and of course there was a lot of reactive activities happening because of the protest and the unfortunate tragedies in many of our cities, including Charlotte. And so we had actually before the George Floyd experience happened in Minneapolis, we had begun a very deep amount of work into diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in terms of trying to essentially turn our staff upside down on these issues and really get at the root causes of things. We thought we were pretty inclusive and accessible, but we realize today that we didn't know what we didn't know. And then in the midst of all of that, we were finalizing a new strategic agenda designed to chart a very rapid growth of our mission over the next 5 years. And then March 13th came. And March 13th at 4:45 in the afternoon, we made a decision to close our museums without understanding when we would start again. In amongst everything that happened to approximately 200 staff people and literally hundreds of thousands of guests that we serve on an annual basis in three different types of museums, two children's museums, a nature museum, and a science and technology center. And so if it was the best of times just before the 13th of March, it was certainly the worst of times overnight. And I think that keeping a lens on DEAI for us became sort of the light in the darkness of where we wanted to be. And it actually enabled us to get much clearer about the difficult decisions that we had to make in the early days. I think you want me to talk about some of those difficult decisions, but the first one of those was really about how we kept our staff safe, first and foremost, and that of the living collections of Discovery Place. And so almost immediately we put staff on remote work for 2 weeks, which gave us time to form that first pivot, and then to find ways to not only provide care and communications internally and externally, but to make longer term decisions that affected both our staff members, our customers, and our donors.
Thank you, Catherine. And thanks for setting up what is probably a common occurrence in many museums and other types of organizations. But to check in, Bert, being the head of a zoo, former head of a science center, were there differences in the way you had to think about the zoo and closure and these equity issues?
Yeah, the equity stuff, like Catherine, we had started working on it before I arrived at the zoo. I've been here about September will be 3 years, so I'm still a newbie to the Denver community. Worked in the zoo and aquarium field before, so it's not a place that I was unfamiliar. We have 3,000 mouths to feed, and it's a 24/7 operation. So you can't turn off the lights and say, I'll come back in 2 weeks, right? And those of you who have any living collection, small or large, know that's a critical component. So that was really hard. There was a lot of discussion early on. WCS in New York had a tiger that got COVID and then another one. And so there's a lot of concern about virus transmission jumping from people to animals and animals to people, and a really imperfect science and all of that. So there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of changes. We kept most of our animal care team intact. We eliminated a few positions in the process, but the brunt of our eliminations, which was 25% of our workforce, happened in other areas throughout the zoo. And unfortunately, as a former educator, a lot of that happened in education and our conservation work. Now, we were able to keep a lot of it based on grants and other things, but they were areas that weren't necessarily revenue generating, and or we thought they were going to be revenue generating. And man, that was hard, right? That was super, super hard. Skilled people, smart people, people that we had worked close with. Some of them had spouses that worked at the zoo, and that one of the two of them was gone and the other one was still here. And you can only imagine how hard that was for their families. And we tried to do it. There's no good way to do that, but we tried to do it in a way that gave them a little bit of dignity at the same time, and trying to help them get through that, at least that first month. We were scared, Barry. I mean, there's no other way to say it than we were just really scared. We didn't know when we were going to be able to reopen. We closed on the 16th of March. We see about 2 million people a year. So we went to 50%. We opened at 25% and 50% attendance, and we lost $11 million in revenue last year. $11 million. That's an earned revenue, right? On a $44 million budget. And then you keep going. That we didn't know if PPP was going to exist. We didn't know any of those things that were happening. So, just like science or anything else, you make decisions based on the data you have in hand, and it was awful. There's no other way. I mean, I think I was on a call earlier today that we were getting emotional about it again. I mean, it's still not an easy thing to talk about. And so at the end of the day, it's our responsibility in leadership positions to make sure that these organizations exist beyond us, in perpetuity, if you will, for our communities. And that's what our community asks of us. That's what our boards ask of us. That's our responsibility. And if we're not the right people to do that, they move us out and bring someone else in. And that, is kind of how it works, right? But in an organization of any size, when you have the social justice issues, COVID happening, a lot of emotion and around all of this stuff, it's a spike, and it's just really, really tough. And so, I know people on this call are interested in, like, so how do I find employment in somewhere? And I know we'll get to that, but look, that skill set, as broad as you can have it, the people who adapted and worked hard to try to figure out different ways to be innovative and communicative and so on and so forth, that's what we really reached hard on, or what we reached into and moved very aggressively on quickly, because we had to. And so I've shared too much there. So it's all yours.
So Barry, I would add to Bert's comment about adaptive behavior and leadership, because I think that is the piece that we've all seen over the last year, that given the number of pivots that we've all made, when we thought we could open and we all gear up for that, you and I in particular worked really hard to try to get North Carolina to reopen museums in the summer and failed miserably at our big attempt. But adaptive behavior and leadership is what separates the workforce of yesterday from the workforce that we need tomorrow and in the years to come. And I think that is a big piece. And the other thing is to give, and Bert was alluding to this, but is to give people hope and to create the opportunities to see the projects that are coming, to try to help them understand how those projects maybe had funding that couldn't be used to employ more staff, because we did a similar layoff, except mine was a little bit more drastic than Bert's. It was 75% of our workforce. So 150 people left the organization at the end of March. And so I would say that, we've been through a little bit of institutional trauma, and now it's important to look towards the future and really embrace and look beyond and let go of all the things that we wish we had done differently, all the things that people felt like got done to them, to really look and say, how can we be even more successful in the future?
Yeah, let's pick up on that comment and start to look at that in our conversation here. Cindy, you work at an art museum, and I imagine that you've done some thinking about how things are going to be different in the future. Can you shed some light on that for us?
Yeah, I think the future, is, how do I frame this? I think the future is actually us accepting some of the things that were already there that we didn't want to see. So, one of the things, as you all were talking, that hit me about the changes that we had to make is that for the first time, I think in a long time, museum professionals, especially in art museums, were starting to pay attention to some voices that had been marginalized. And I'm going to call out two names in particular, people like LaTonya Autry, who is at the Cleveland Contemporary, and Kelly Morgan, who was at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And these individuals had been telling a story about how change needed to happen in institutions for quite some time. And I think we were all okay with just little incremental changes, and, you know, getting around a bandwagon that would create, you know, some future change. But they were calling for much more drastic change. And the sad part about this epidemic is that while it's been a horrible, you know, moment in our lives, the silver lining is it has allowed us to leapfrog, I think, and begin to look at this systemic change we need to make and the fact that it needs to happen now. And so the future is actually realizing that the voices and the members of our community that we needed to be listening to are now much more visible. And hopefully what we're doing as institutions, in particular our art museums, is I think we're finally starting to listen. So that didn't quite answer your question, but I think it's just something that needed to be said, especially from the field I come from.
Well, systemic change, I think, is on everybody's mind on this call and across the various fields of museum work. Kirsten, I know you've been thinking a lot about it, and would you share your thoughts?
Sure. So some of the things we've been challenging ourselves with is there's so much work we've been doing internally that are focused on organizational culture, infrastructure, how we represent ourselves and how we represent in the community. So it's everything from, you know, the work, as Catherine talked about, to diversify our staff, which also meant that we are making things a lot more transparent. We're moving job descriptions and interviews into competency-based, not degree-based. We are creating a process to streamline internal hiring and promotion. You know, we have criteria that our marketing team has to meet when they're, you know, looking across a quarter of here, you know, perceived ethnicity that we're putting out on our marketing material. We had a lot of stuff going like that, right? Of like, how do we make ourselves better, but internally? And pay scale was a huge part of this, right? We've been moving the organization to $15 an hour as a minimum. Started with full-time staff, now to part-time staff. So chugging away at that, right? But really all internal and in the way we appear to the public, but not that other part of this conversation, which is speak louder, speak clearly, name the issues. So for us, it was a big kick in the pants to say like, yeah, not enough, just not enough. And, you know, some of the first things we did were taking some of, again, too internal of a program. So a terrific National Institute of Health grant we had with youth at our local NPR station around racism and racial inequities in healthcare, and taking that from this rather internal program, developing those youth as advocates, and in providing materials for distance learning to just say, no, it should be across everything, right? And it's a very important conversation here in Cleveland. So that suddenly meant to us, okay, I need to speak more about that publicly. We need to put that in more of our exhibits, right? We were hosting Body Worlds RX when we reopened to the public in mid-June of 2020. And we said, well, we can't change things inside Body Worlds RX, but what we can do is we can transform the experience as people walk into it and out of it, and make sure that those very important conversations about racism, racial inequities in healthcare, that's got to be front and center. It's a critical conversation in Cleveland, and it's critical right now. So that's really been the shift for us is I don't want to call it navel gazing. It was meaningful work we were doing before to make significant changes in the organization, but we were not standing up and shouting in our community about these critical issues where you see a real intersection between science and racism. And there are plenty of those intersections. So we have a lot to talk about. So that's been the big shift for us.
Well, we all probably share some common thoughts on approaches towards the future. there are differences as well. Christian, we had a chance to talk the other day, and you said something that really struck me as in the form of a question. And the question is, do we want to be as large an organization as we once were? Could you address that and other thoughts you have as you go forward with your organization?
Yes, this is a question I think we should always be asking ourselves, even when there isn't a crisis that exists. Is how large do you need to be, and who needs to be able to do what work? When we shut down, we actually went into sort of our own crisis management mode, and we did our layoffs and unpaid leaves, I think within about 8 days of our shutdown. It happened very quickly. We did not have a lot of cash on hand as our organization. And again, I'm at the Michigan Science Center in Detroit, and it was a challenging situation. And we had so many great staff. When I got there, I didn't feel like we had enough. I don't think I've ever been in a position in this field like I felt like there was enough staff to do all the work. And so to go to less staff and try to manage that is really tough. And to try to figure out how to right size your organization is right sizing your priorities, right sizing what your strategy is, trying to figure out where do you need subject matter experts that you can contract, where do you need staff as FTEs that are there to work as part of the planning and coordinating. So I think everyone is going to be going through a challenge of trying to figure out how this should shake down, how you should design your organizational structure, whether you want to go to a top-down typical hierarchy, whether it needs to be matrixed, where people are more doing projects in the middle, whether you want to be more flat as an organization. I think that we just have to be comfortable with our organizational structure and not necessarily feel as though what we had in the past is what we need for the future. And I can tell you, we lost a lot of great people. And it's funny, you have people from the news media seeing what you're doing. Oh, you reopened and things are going great. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking about all those people that aren't there as a leader, that people you need right now that you don't have the funds to bring back. It's a challenging thing. And it disrupts the culture because people have personal relationships within the informal networks that exist, and that makes it difficult. But I will say that the one thing that is most important to me is if you're a mission-driven organization, you have mission-driven people, anything is possible. And above all else, you have to feed that mission, because that's the real reason why a lot of us are here. But it is an opportunity, as Kirsten and I were talking about, with a smaller team to address some inequities in pay. And as you grow, what do you prioritize, your inequities in pay, or do you prioritize bringing new people in? And so Kirsten and I were just talking about that as well. Like how can you create a plan that allows you to be able to do both?
Barry, just to jump in really quick, I think first of all, Christian's a great leader, and I've been lucky enough to work with him for years, off and on throughout our careers together. And I have no doubt that he will lead that organization into success. And I've shared that with him. I would like to add something that Christian and I have talked about years and years ago, which was this idea of what's a properly balanced organization financially, right? How do you is it a third of public, a third of earned, a third of whatever, right? And this goes on. I mean, the amount of times I've had this discussion at multiple organizations is a little bit exhausting, but I think this time showed us like, whoa, when you have too much reliance on any one piece, you can be at high risk, right? So a balanced portfolio of revenues and figuring that out is way easier said than done. But to be strategic about thinking about that is really important. So when the federal government came out with their PPP loan project or loan initiative, that stuff in some cases took over that earned revenue piece for a lot of people. Now it went to pay for staff, but it took over that revenue source. And what's going to happen in the future if your capacity doesn't grow like we were talking about earlier, like if it doesn't grow back, and that might be the right decision. How are you going to pay for the stuff that you're going to do and you want to do? And, you know, let's be honest, these organizations are not inexpensive to run. And so how do we do that in a better way and be thoughtful about that?
So most of the panelists here are CEOs of nonprofits. Joseph, you have a different view from the bridge, I'm sure. You have your own for-profit company, and you are a provider to many nonprofit organizations. You've been listening to this conversation. Enlighten us a little bit about what you're thinking now, both within your own company, but also in what you observe and hear from the people you talk to.
Thanks, Barry. It certainly resonates, all of what you've heard so far with the many conversations we've had right away with the folks that we've been in touch with, you know, through projects or what have you. And, you know, I think I've learned so much thinking you already get it, right? And then something like this happens and it really just challenges all of your assumptions. One of the things I was reminded of, it sort of seems simple, is that museums are not a monolithic sector. Even within the museum field, you know, science centers, children's museums, collecting museums, zoos, there's huge differences. And we saw that play out through many factors, you know, PPP loans, or how many capital projects were present at the time that the big dip happened in attendance, and therefore how many staff could sort of survive that based on the capital projects. And, you know, it's super painful, of course, to stand by and watch all that happen and be asked questions like, you know, how long is this going to last and what do we do? You know, you put yourself out there as an advisor and as a planner. And I think I too was appreciating something else Christian mentioned when we got together on Monday. And it's that if you think about this from a science perspective and you try to be evidence-based, it's not over yet. And we still don't really know like where it'll all shake out in the end. And that sense of uncertainty, I think, is also really uncomfortable. And I think we're all very tired of being so uncertain. I do actually have a couple things that I had thrown together just because I felt like maybe the folks coming to the webinar wanted to hear a little bit about what do we see going forward. So if I can indulge you for a moment, I'm just going to go ahead and point out the things that we think about on behalf of our clients and our own organization about the future. If I can make that work, let's see here. Hold on a second.
Please do, Joseph.
Okay. All right. So you all know impacts, experience, and this is one of Colleen's more recent studies, and it just talks a little bit about in January of 2020, pre-pandemic, she had been projecting, you know, about a 3%, 4% increase, slow increase in exhibit-based organization attendance. She's separating exhibit-based here from performance-based, so separate from like symphony orchestras and things. This is pre-pandemic, and then the darker brown line is this same data, but just reflected against January of 21 realities. And we can see that it went down hugely in 2020, fiscal calendar 2020, coming back up again through 21. And I think the good news is, at least from the data she's collected from the organizations that she's surveying, you know, that attendance looks like it's back pretty much all the way back by 22. And of course, for that to be true, it means that by the end of this year, we should all see attendance back to where it had been. And that's just one data point and one perspective on that. I like to go a step deeper and say, okay, well, you know, what has motivated people to attend our informal, you know, learning environments in the first place? And how can we either intuitively or through, you know, other kinds of visitor response, figure out what that means given this result of the pandemic? And you guys have all seen these kinds of charts before. This is Culture Track from 2017, but it's all about having fun, experiencing new things, doing stuff with other people. I don't know about you, but none of those motivations seem particularly negatively impacted by the pandemic in terms of recovery. Like when we come back out of this again, it isn't like the entire market will have shifted its thinking, or somehow the need for these kinds of things will have been eclipsed with some other technology or some other thing. In fact, you could argue, if you were an optimist, that those kinds of motivations actually are pointing in the right direction for a resurgence or a recovery. This is similar. This is Aztec's Cove survey. And I just really like looking at that first line there, you know, the top motivation to spend time together as a group or family. Okay, that's the one thing that people bitch about the most with the effects of the pandemic. We haven't been able to get together as a family or as a group. So that to me, you know, says good things. You know, this is the thing I picked up on this morning. This is Culture Track's more recent survey. This is talking about the emotional toll of the pandemic. I'm just looking at the second from the left here and the last one on the right. You know, this is a, you know, how are you feeling kind of answer. I'm feeling super bored. Well, that should say something good about a response out of the pandemic. And this last one, I'm feeling very disconnected with others. If you match this up with the previous information about why we know people come to museums, I think that says something pretty decent. Last chart I'm going to show you is one that I was surprised at myself, and it's coming from our own data source here, and it has everything to do with you know, how we predict, you know, where we're going to want to be in the future. What you're looking at here is a chart that comes from one firm's marketing sort of business development database, right? You track like the various notifications, RFPs, and things like that. I decided I would just dump this into an Excel really quickly and show you what we're seeing. Now, this is not necessarily at all the results of one company's you know, success or failure in the marketplace, or it's not really a financial thing at all. It's strictly a reflection of the kind of volume of notification. And there's plenty of little deviations in terms of how this data gets charted and cleaned up and categorized. But the big picture, the big overarching picture, you can clearly see here with a level of noise in the market, right, in the first quarter of 2020, dropping off dramatically there in the second quarter. But just look at how that's grown back through the course of 2020. And then take a look at the last quarter there. And again, this is not necessarily at all reliable, other than, you know, one little snapshot of the sort of volume of requests, the volume of, you know, interest out there in doing projects. Now, is it because people are, you know, reacting to having delayed their projects for a long time? Is it museums that still don't have money but are thinking they want to do new work? Nevertheless, you know, we look at this kind of result and say, okay, well, you know, between the attendance projections and the idea of new projects, you know, maybe there's some good things that are on the horizon.
Well, there's a dose of optimism for us, and thanks for the illustration of that and the presentation of some data. But I'd like to get some feedback from the rest of the panelists. I mean, you've been tracking these kind of things too. I mean, are you as optimistic about the future, and how is your organization changing? Bert, I think.
Yeah. I'll be fairly brief with this, but I'm very optimistic. Now, I'm kind of a half glass full guy anyway, so that is a little bit of just my nature. But boy, I tell you, there are some dark days there that I just didn't know how we were going to get through it. I'm really optimistic. I think there's a pent-up demand. I think we're starting to see in the travel industry indications of people wanting to get out and do things again with their family. Living here in Colorado, I will tell you the outdoor spaces throughout Colorado were packed. Highest visitation in some parks. Everything was just flooded with people. So people were really ready to do that. If you tried to buy a tent during the pandemic, you really struggled. A bike, you really struggled, right? There were some things like that. I have a sense that people are going to hold on to some of those activities, but they're going to go back to some of the things that they did with their families, they enjoy doing together, and to enhance. We're smart fun, right? Like we're a way to have fun and do some things and learn a little bit or expand your backgrounds and experiences in a broader way than you do in certain places. So I'm optimistic. Travel industry is one indicator. Hotels, another indicator. Third indicator would be the speed of which we sell out of tickets. And I will tell you, with time ticketing, it's been a really interesting control point, and we are selling out daily at 50% capacity. And that blows me away, right? Like, how does that, if people are really that uncomfortable, why would they be visiting? And they're getting more and more of it. Now, we are outdoors, and that makes a significant difference in people's psychological safety piece of this. And then the last thing is vaccines. The vaccine distribution and the amount of people who are adopting vaccines. Colorado has the lowest vaccination rate for every other vaccine except this. And that is very interesting to me. So in everything else, they're like slow to vaccine. But with this, we're already bumping up against a bunch of really, really positive numbers. So I think that's going to make a huge difference. And hopefully we'll see whatever return.
Yeah, and with that return comes revenues. How do the rest of you feel? Do you share that optimism?
I think the consistency of that optimism is where we're still very cautious, if that's fair, right? So absolutely, we cannot manage the crowds and the number of people who would like to be at Great Lakes Science Center right now. We sell out on a regular basis. Spring break sold out a week in advance. I mean, it's very hard to manage expectations with that, and it's a delight to have that problem. But we also keep looking ahead and saying first of all, we kind of projected ahead. There's been really important taxpayer support that's come through Congress for organizations like us. And, we're constantly presenting our finances in our, we do a weekly staff meeting, monthly, all staff, we churn through our finances together, and then quarterly the board sees it. Constantly trying to have to remind, like, if we didn't have this taxpayer support, right, here's where we would be, even with this high attendance. So there's a mixed optimism there. Like, what does next year look like without that kind of support? And what if, we try to always plan about, we might have to shut our doors again, right? If there's a flurry of infections, if we can't keep our guests, if we can't keep our staff safe, following P1 and the burst of infections in Canada even has been concerning, right? So I think that's the mix. Is we are optimistic, but we are not optimistic of how consistent it will be. And so we're regularly planning for what would it still look like if we had to close for a period of time again.
Yeah, Christian.
Yes, I also think, just building off of that an exercise in us understanding our business models really needs to happen. And we're trying to figure out how to approach that at our organization. And I know that there are other leaders in our field that have been talking about it as well. And what I'm realizing is that we forget how much our business model is tied to who we are. So obviously, if you just look at this as a way to generate earned revenue, you wouldn't go into a business like this because you won't make enough money to do it. Let's just be honest. And people have tried this. It is not, there's not a profit motive for the staff in most cases. People are there more mission oriented. So I think we need some kind of hybrid or an evolution of who we are, so that we don't have that internal tension between revenue generating sources and the whole reason why we think we're in business. And both of those are changing, both in terms of, as Bert was saying, where the revenue sources come from and how you optimize those, which could take years, and also how you optimize the motivations of the team who's actually doing the work. And so that concept of moving from nice to necessary that we talk about, how necessary were we during this period? I mean, most of us had to try to really flex, and as others were saying, and pivot to try to make sure that we were as connected to our audience as possible. But I have to say, we were not really, even though we had a great digital program and we got great press, deep down inside, we knew it wasn't the best that we could do. We didn't have all the people here on staff to help make it happen. We hadn't really had a strong digital presence and program prior to this, although we built off what we already had. So I think there needs to be an internal reckoning of just how we value ourselves, what our value propositions are to our audiences and communities, and to what extent do we need our boards to change to understand a little bit more about how we should be funded and supported, so that the team, the passionate individuals, many that are on this, on this Zoom right now, whether they're in organizations right now or they're freelancing, they still care about this work. We've got to find a way to get us to be more necessary for the future. What does that look like? Is it guarding against sort of the criticisms and the disbelief that goes around science? Is that part of it? Is it the classical topics like, climate change? To what extent does racial equity and social justice issues fit into who we are? Well, now we don't have a choice to be able to say those are separate anymore. I think we need organizational structures and leadership that actually sees those things as interwoven. I can't give you what that answer is, but I know that if we go back to compartmentalizing this and siloing our different drivers for success, we'll be right back where we were before.
And I would agree with Kristen that, we can't choose. We have to take and we have to do and in whatever small fashion that then builds the capacity to do it at a larger scale. But we also cannot second guess ourselves through this process. We understand what makes our budgets work, or those of us in the administrative and financial worlds understand it. And what's been fascinating for me as we work towards a fiscal year 22, starting in July 1, and we build this budget, how even as conservative as I might want to be around revenues, you look at the numbers, you do the math, and it's just right under where you were in FY20. And that's what's so fascinating to me, to see that, 6 months ago, it felt like we could never get back to some semblance of what we were. But I think actually we can, and we will be smarter about the roles of the work, the roles and the work that we have in our institution, so that we have more intelligence to help us drive our business, more understanding about how to relate to our audiences as they continue to become much and much more diverse, and that we show up in a way that we are authentic to both of those pieces.
Yeah, so let's dive into this a little bit. It's not just opening the doors again to what we had right before we closed the doors, right? So how are you all thinking about your teams, the culture of your organization, and how that has changed pre-COVID to what you see coming ahead?
I could jump in here.
Please.
Yeah, I think, for us, when we had to do the layoffs, it was actually a moment where we realized it would not just be a temporary change. We decided to do a restructure that we would then hold on to. So we cut our budget by 30%, and that meant about a 40%, 30 to 40% reduction in staff, but that would be us moving forward. That would be our future. That there wouldn't be a major rebound at the end of this. And I think one of the challenges with that, and it's why it was October before we actually made our changes, is that in that restructure, we really needed to rethink some of the major functions of our institution. So to give you one example, we used to have very different divisions. We had a division that oversaw security, a division that oversaw our gallery associates, the folks who are in the galleries, another division that was frontline facing, the phones, the front desk. And we combined those and decided to keep the staff that had flexibility of skills rather than totally defined skills. And this happened in multiple areas across the institution. And decided that that would become one team. They would be cross-trained across the institution. They would learn this, they would be able to work in the control room as well as the front desk. They would have visitor experience training. But we would move them all to full-time. We would move the salaries up, and we would create a lot more support and leadership around those roles. So for us, I think, we knew that the new us would have to look different, but it was a moment to experiment with new structures and how the teams might work together. The big aha for us, and this may be different in other institutions, was that we really feel that individuals who had very, very narrow skill sets were harder to hold on to at the institution. And that what we knew the future institution would need were folks that were capable of not only being able to do multiple things in one department, but possibly being able to work cross departments, creating new teams and new opportunities, whether that was in curatorial, where the tradition has been, you have a very, very particular skill set and you only do that, but we couldn't afford that anymore. So, and then the interesting part of this is we knew then there would need to be actually the folks we would bring on wouldn't have probably any of the skill sets that we let go, but we're looking at folks who have experience in social work, folks who have worked in community organizing, that those are the next layer of cross-disciplinary skills that we're needing for the future. So our teams and our structure look very different from this time a year ago.
I think Cindy, I'll just quickly say, I think Cindy brings up a really interesting point, and to some of the skill sets that you mentioned, we lost people in those areas, and we're still realizing how important those things are and need to expand. And perhaps we don't have the funding and support to be able to do it at this time, but it doesn't mean that that need goes away, obviously. Also, I will say that unfortunately, because the way sometimes the organizations are designed, you don't get to see all the talents and skills that people have because of their job functions and categories. So it's likely that people were let go that actually had multiple skills that we never asked them to be able to show off or to be able to do. So we need better ways of managing talent, looking at skill sets and giving people opportunities to try new things. Our approach to doing that was doing it more in a project environment. So we just basically got rid of the structures that we had and we managed the crisis as a single project. And then that allowed us to tap into all these resources so people weren't tied to just their job titles, which is kind of like what Cindy is alluding to. But I also feel like there are a lot of people that are laid off that have a ton of skill sets and probably need to do a better job. Look in the mirror and ask yourself, how do you sell yourself a little bit better on those things that you can do? It's not easy to do by yourself. So grab a partner, grab a peer that trusts you, who knows you, and have them take a look at your resume to show off what you can do beyond what you're looking at. Because you can't be tied to just the last organization you were in or previous skill sets that you have that you want to grow. How do you position yourself to be able to do lots of different things for the next opportunities that you might have?
I want to put a word in for the importance and the power of strong collaboration skills as an area of focus. When we're challenged with all of the stress of pandemic and uncertain futures and all that, we are all not necessarily our best selves, right? When we're in our interactions with our team, with the folks on the outside, and we preach collaboration as a 21st century skill. I think that's come up a lot, right? But what we've learned over the last year of coming up with a reckoning here, on our own performance, is that collaboration really is an interpersonal set of skills, right? It has a lot more to do with trust and listening and communication one-to-one than it does with systems or with spaces. So we've seen some good gains there in working on ways to get people to truly listen and truly work together as teams. And I think that can apply to lots of things that I'm hearing you guys talk about as well.
There was an old Deming philosophy management guru who said, attack the process, not the people. And it stuck with me years and years and years ago. And so if we can find new processes and new opportunities and new ways of doing things, we might be able to change our structures and get some things assembled. And remember that nationally, the highest turnover rates are between 25 and 35-year-olds. They move a lot, and they're in those roles and they move. I think I know in Colorado it's like 33%. I think nationally it's like 45 or 48. But it's a lot of transition in that age group. And some of that's for new opportunities, some of that's for building skill sets and so on. So if you're in that younger demographic from an age perspective, build your skills, build as many skills as you can possibly get an understanding of who you are, what you really love, what you're passionate about, and not just about what you like, but what you're going to, change the world with, right? And how you're going to live and own that. The flexibility thing that Cindy mentioned is so critical. I think, being able to be malleable and workable and try something else out. I was fortunate early in my career to have that kind of experience, and I built that. I mean, that was just how I got lucky. I was at the right place at the right time, and so I'd encourage you to seek out those things because I think it's really, really important. And then the last piece that Cindy mentioned about reorganizing and rethinking our organizations from the staffing levels and what that looks like. I think a lot of large nonprofits were on the edge of being expenses crossing the revenue line, and they were, and even smaller organizations, and those, that comes to a nexus where you have to say, what am I not going to do, or what am I going to increase to do it, right? And it's not always that easy. You can't just let more people in. So special exhibits and all these things, kept fulfilling that for us. And that, has been kind of the thing that we rely on to get us through to the next piece. That's all got to be rethought and kind of reconsidered, I think.
I want to acknowledge that some of these things that are coming up about looking at the multitude of skills that your staff have, looking at skills that are outside of the job description. And I'll just speak for our organization. For our organization, going through some generational shifts to really appreciate different culture, different approaches across our staff, that was an awakening for us pre-pandemic that has only become more pronounced during the pandemic, of really coming to value that many staff coming into the workforce, joining our organization, are bringing a multitude of interests that really could be quite wider, and a multitude of expertise that's wider than their job description. And we have pretty darn broad job descriptions. We have the, we're one of many organizations that require, like, hey, when we're busy, when it's a holiday, I don't care who you are. Like, I did lunch duty for spring break camps last week because, in the middle of spring break when it's busy and we've got a lot of staff on the floor and we've got a lot of staff running our camps and outreach happening, I don't care who you are, you're going to take a shift. We've got to sign up. Everybody does it, right? And that's a normal cultural thing here. And it's been going for a long time, right? I mean, I will never forget going to COSI in 1990. One was Aztec, first at COSI in the 90s, like 93, 92. And seeing all that in operation and being like, yeah, we're doing that. So even with that kind of normal culture at the organization, we still had awakenings of appreciating broader interests and skills for staff that has been difficult for some, right? And we have some longtime staff who, my job is this, you ask questions related to this. And it was a much harder shift for them, where we actually found that some of the culture change leadership for us really came from staff who had fewer years in the field, but who had the mindset of, I walk in with all these interests, I bring all of it to work, and work is not necessarily the number one thing in my life. And that's been really powerful. And the more we shut up and listen to our younger staff, the better it was. So that's definitely been a huge player for us in the pandemic, as we attended more to that range of skills in our staff, and it'll be more prominent as we come out of the pandemic.
Well, those are cultural changes within an organization, and I think you all agree that the culture that you had is changing, and in some ways is changing from younger people on the staff demanding some changes. It's coming from you as a leader and the change you'd like to see. What's true for people who are out of work and want to get back into this business as is probably the same for people who are still in it and on the job today. There are changes. Let me ask, are any of you beginning to hire again? And if so, what are you looking for in people? What are those qualities you're looking for? Are they different than they were in the past? Should I call on someone?
I'm happy to jump in. I'm usually quick to respond to these things, and I told Barry before this whole thing started, like, cut me off, because I can go on if given the opportunity.
All right, well, you're off then. No,
Not
please
that
do.
quick. So we are rehiring, and we're being slow to rehire. I think a general theme that I continue to hear from friends and colleagues in the business is that as people are bringing back workforces, they're being cautious about it. What we don't want to do, I mean, we made a deep, one-time, big change, because I didn't want to have to do 2 or 3 of these. And I've been in other organizations where I've had to do this, and learned a lot after 9/11 at the Shed, and in 2008 at John Ball Zoo, and been through some really, really rough times, right? Financial times. So I knew that I didn't want to do multiple reductions. I wanted to do it one time really hard. So now hiring back, we're probably far more intentional. Like Kirsten, we're being very different in our job descriptions than we have in the past, our position descriptions, what they look like, and being more inclusive in the ways that we believe will give us a stronger, more inclusive pool of candidates. With that comes more applications. And with that comes a lot more variety and screening and challenges around that. So people are rehiring, the things are getting better, but it's not happening as fast as I think those people out of work would like it to see. I will tell you that the thing that I'm worried about, and we have a education and conservation position that we combined from 2 areas into one. The thing I'm worried about is, how do we make sure that we get the right talent, and that we're not getting the right talent for now, if that makes sense? Because we're in, as was said, reactive mode in many cases. So how do we think strategically about bringing someone on that could replace me, or could replace another senior staff member in one way, shape, or form? How do we build and grow talent and build succession planning? There are 7 zoo director positions open of large organizations right now. 7. In my entire long history in this industry, I've never seen anything like it. And that is going to happen in every single industry, right? There's a lot of transition going on. So there's going to be a lot of movement. And so, be patient, but also be forward and thinking, and how do I add value to that organization? Where do I want to be, and where can I go as an employee and a future employee strategically to help that organization advance their mission?
Catherine, how have things changed? I know you're doing some hiring now.
We are.
How's your thinking changed about the qualities and mindsets of the people you're hiring?
Well, I think first and foremost, they both have to bring the ability to have adaptive leadership skills. So that ability to work quickly, to experiment, and then to find ways to scale and advance, spin the flywheel, so to speak. And then secondly, they've got to come in with an equity and inclusion mindset. That's not something you train people on. You can give them techniques, you can help them recognize it, but they either have it in their soul or they don't. And so, you know, I'm incredibly grateful to, you know, scads of leaders across Discovery Place who are doing hiring right now, and they are relentless. It is much more about, will this person fit into the culture that we have built, and will they grow? And that's that adaptive piece. I think the other thing is that we're going to be hiring for positions we've never had before. And that will bring a new mindset of thinking in organizations. I think we're accustomed in our field to have people who are lifers. And I don't think we're going to have lifers anymore. I think that we should look at, what does someone bring to our organization, and what can we impart into them that helps them be successful in future years? Because our alumni of science centers and other museums is just as important, because they're our best fans, as those who we keep throughout their careers.
I have one quick concern I think I'll put out there just to stir the pot a little bit. As we've been going through this year, one of the things we're doing is actually stripping away a lot of the degree requirements that I think institutions like ours have used as gatekeepers to our field. But one of my concerns is, as we begin to look for different kinds of skills and experiences from our employees, I've noticed that the university system continues to narrow these degree-based programs. You know, a curatorial studies program that deals with X, or a museum education program that just deals with Y. And so actually I'm finding that there's a lot of misalignment between the training programs that are out there and actually the direction that at least my institution is beginning to make around, you know, what are the capacities someone brings, and lived experiences, and how do we begin to really diversify our institution based on a number of factors. So something just to stir the pot maybe, but it's definitely a concern.
I would just echo what Cindy said. I think we had this conversation at Museums Advocacy Day in Washington, D.C. over a year ago at the table where I was. A couple people were in some programs for museum studies, and they were talking about their experience and was it worth it, or they wanted to, you know, other folks wanted to go into the program. And we talked about this very thing on what, you know, hopefully the organizations, these universities are not giving students a false sense of security of what opportunities are out there. Especially with what Catherine mentioned, if you're looking at more diversity of skills, narrowing that resource may or may not be helpful in terms of the job market. Now, it may be helpful for you to execute your role, having subject matter expertise to a higher level of quality, but it doesn't really give you an opportunity if all of a sudden that job is not available at that particular history museum. Where else are you going to go? So it becomes challenging to think about as you design your own career trajectory and start to think about the multiple positions that you might have at different organizations. What sort of skill sets allow you to round things out, and to what extent can you re-articulate the background that you have to apply it to different aspects of your work, which is also important as well. I will, if I can say this one thing, it's challenging because you need subject matter expertise within structural places in your organization. But at the same time, you need people to be able to flex and speak different languages so they can collaborate, which is what was discussed earlier. And these things sometimes see in contravention to each other. But I think there's an opportunity for people, especially those that are out of work now, to begin to look at their skill sets and maybe apply to work at a place where they haven't been before. So in other words, if you have a science degree, go ahead and apply to that history museum. Because there might be some elements of what your skill sets to be applied to other experiences might give you a greater opportunity to connect for all the reasons that the leaders are talking about right now.
And, you know, and Christian's a great example of that, right? So Adler Planetarium, Shedd Aquarium, right?
Yep.
Denver Nature and Science, St. Louis Science Center, and now there. So he's kind of a unicorn in that way of having different experiences that he's been able to translocate in that way. And I would say it's a really, really important thing that was said. The other thing, Barry, I think is interesting to me is what are going to be, I think Catherine said it, what are those 21st, 22nd, 23rd century skills that are going to be moving forward? Like if you're a computer technician, you're not going to be a line keeper, right? Unlikely. But because that area is so intensely utilizing computer technology, you might be an effective tool there, right? So what does that look like as we move forward? How are our industries changing, and how do we upskill and get that those attributes in place?
It also seems like we're a place where people can find meaning in their work. And I think when we think about people who are in work but want to do something different, or people who are looking for work, they're looking to make a difference. And I think it's our job to bring our mission to life, to understand why someone like Christian would go to 5 different science-leaning institutions in different experiences and roles to ultimately get to where he is today. And so it is about a building process. And I think we're more open to that today than ever before. I'm an art historian leading a network of science and children's museums. Now, no one would look at that academic background and think, how could she ever get there? So, we all, if there's one message for our participants on this call today, is that it is really about your skills, because we're all looking for your skills. So just tell us what they are. It's not about your degrees. It's nice to have them.
My experience, sorry, Catherine.
No, that's okay.
In my experience, companies like Roto are really good at finding the right talent. And they're a little different than the way most nonprofits go about it. Joe, could you share, am I right in that? Or
Boy, Barry, I mean,
the whole bottom
appreciate
line.
that reflection. I think we struggle like everybody to again, bring in people who have that really authentic sense of mission, that they really want to be here. The work is hard. The hours can be long. It's frustrating to try to have a vision and a dream and then go through all those steps to execute that. And people have to have a, capacity for it. I do agree that, it's a mixed bag in terms of higher education relating to success in at least in the kind of work that we do, which is more, usually exhibition driven in all those different components. So let's see, passion for the work is key. That versatility is really key, at least in capital projects, because then you're, again, not siloed into one role, but there's a range of things that you can do. I think training, ongoing training, constantly talking about the industry, because we tend to know things and they happen up here. And then, we might articulate that, but we don't think about the overtness of sharing that knowledge with other people. So mentorship is a huge thing for us, and across the relationships we have with other institutions, and you got to be planful about that and intentional about it.
So everybody here is employed at the moment, but I'd like to ask you a question about people on the webinar today in our audience who are looking to get back into the business. We've answered some of those with your comments already, and some of the skills and mindsets that people need to get rehired into a museum environment. What advice would you give someone today to get back in addition to what's been said during the webinar? Does anybody have specific advice? Christian?
Put one out there that you've already accomplished is being on this webinar. And it may seem very simple, but there wasn't always a museum expert or a forum for this kind of discussion when the layoffs took place. Bert mentioned a really interesting point that he's wanted to do everything once and not have to go back to this, because we've been in those organizations where you think, oh, we're going to cut this out and everything is going to be fine. And then you go with multiple layoffs and people never really feel secure in terms of where they are. But being able to connect to this environment is very helpful, because hopefully people are taking away from this that, you know what, I need to go back and look at my skill set and say, and kind of reinterpret this in terms of what I really want to do. Maybe you left a job and you might think, hey, I want to go back into museums. But if you added up all the things you didn't like about the organization or didn't like about the job, there'd be a list there too. So that's not a bad thing. It means we want people to come and help us fix these things, and to make ourselves more attractive as organizations and build a place where people can love their mission, but still work together effectively. So I would say, in terms of that advice, being able to connect to people that are in the field is really important. Your personal network should probably be expanded. Pick up the phone, call some folks. If you know some people on this call that are speaking right now, I mean, on the panel, give them a call, send them their resume. Like we are not not open to being able to work with folks to give them opportunities and make connections. Because if we don't do that for our own field, what does that say about us? If we don't feel that there's talent out there, we're looking for it. And then the final piece is, now, because of the magic of Zoom, you get to be able to work all over the country or maybe across the world with your skills, which previously maybe you thought you would only work in a specific city or a particular region. And now you have the ability to be able to maybe work at that organization you always wanted to work to. You might be working as a 1099. Maybe you're more comfortable with that. But that opportunity is available. So take full advantage of it. Great opportunity to build up skills. And when you finally see that one position that you want, you'll be more prepared for it.
Bert?
I'd echo what Christian said. In all of those cases, many of us started in this field as volunteers and part-time staff and worked. I did, and I know a couple other people on this call have, and that might have to be where some folks restart a little bit. They may not have the optimal opportunity for them, but getting the foot back in the door and getting some of those experiences and opportunities may be good. It's really tough. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's going to be a slow to hire community overall. But as Christian said, expanding your networks, offering yourself up, saying, hey, I'd like to try this. I'd like to be a part of this. If my work's good and you think there's value there and so on, and it's a good fit, I'd love to see if there's an opportunity to continue. That might be a way to consider and think about.
Somebody in the chat mentioned volunteering, and I have to admit, one of the things we're looking at right now is at a time where so many people and there's so many needs, where you're spending your time. We've been looking at the possibility of hiring, and we're really interested in folks who have volunteered in institutions like schools to do trauma-informed care, because that would bring an entire new skill set into our institution. And you don't have to be necessarily an expert in that, but we need someone who's been in some spaces, if they've helped to coordinate marches and protests locally, and have a sense of who those community members are that are really pushing the needle around social justice issues. Those are things we're super interested in, and they don't fall into the typical set of museum expectations, but they're actually all pretty aligned with where our institutions are going.
Anybody else?
Looking at attendees and looking at some other questions, it does seem like we have both staff who are, we've got folks who are unemployed, underemployed, and employed. So let me hone in also on a couple of questions that are coming up. We're one of those organizations where we're not going to be doing a lot of hiring. We've been working for years to get everybody up to a $15 minimum, keeping the top salaries frozen. We actually, a significant portion of positions eliminated for us, we're right at the top. And so now what we are focused on, and this is in part coming from a real push from staff, when we have these conversations about, okay, I know everyone's, putting in way too many hours. We're all working too hard. We're going to try and hire and as soon as we can and release, some of that pressure. And the response has been, yeah, but we've been saying we need to still adjust the salaries in the middle and get those positions into improved salaries, adjust those job descriptions, improve those salaries. And so we have shifted expectations to say, okay, if you're willing to hang on with this higher workload for now, we will increase those salaries. So that's what we're chugging through at the moment. At the same time, yes, I absolutely just signed a form for someone that came in as a volunteer on the weekend outside of a part-time paid job she had. And we did just hire her just part-time so far, but never say never. I know we're going to be doing some hiring, but for us, we really, there's a question about salaries. If you are someone who is employed, make sure you're documenting the range of work you're doing, because right now what we're asking everybody to do is help us rewrite their job descriptions as part of improving their salaries. The more you can document and really speak up about the range of skills you've brought to your work during the pandemic, the better position your organization is in to change your job in a better way, improve your salary, promote you, and just in general, make sure you're really valued for the work you've been doing, because everyone's working flat out. You need to make sure that your work has been noticed.
Yeah,
I want to remind everybody that one of the things we learned from pandemic is how well Zoom works to get collaboration to happen without having to be physically in the same place. That's a message both for those who want to help but don't want to relocate, right? To go and take on a job or take on an IC freelance kind of role, but also for museums, recognizing that there's a whole country, North America, worth of talent out there that you don't necessarily have to attract, physically into your own city in order to benefit from.
I think people will be more inclined in this hiring back, and I'd be interested to see what the panelists said. There's been some discussions around part-time or contract work or freelance work or whatever it might be. That is an option for people if they don't require all the benefits and things like that are usually associated with that, but it's just not volunteering, and part-time work is just not a reality for some folks, and they may have to make a career decision to go in a different direction, right, to pay the bills and do the things that they need to do. We all understand that, and I don't think any of us would say, oh, just keep hanging in there, because it might not happen, and we may have another wave. Some cities have done much better than others as it relates to this, and that's affected their organizations. And others are open, and there's zoos that are at full capacity, and some that just opened, a little bit of time ago. And so it's just all over the place. So part of where you live and being flexible enough to say, either I can work remotely via Zoom or whatever the technology might be, or I'm willing to move. I'm willing to change locations and go to a new place to live. And I think that's a big deal. There's a comment about equity in pay. And I just want to say that we are having some really big discussions about that internally and what that looks like. There is a lot of need of work in that space. When I entered the field, I remember saying, oh, nonprofits don't pay very well, so don't expect to get paid, right? Like, that's just the way it's going to be. And having multiple jobs to hang on to one was a tough thing to do. And I totally get that. And so we've got to think really smart about this. There is a living wage scale that was developed by MIT that we've been looking at, and you can do it state by state, region by region. And that Denver's gotten very, very expensive to live, very, very expensive to do anything. And so we're concerned about that, and especially from some of our lowest paid individuals, and how do we figure that out in a different way So I think it's important for us. Oh, there it is. Someone put it in. Christian, thank you. And that is an interesting tool to kind of look at and think about in your own way, what it would take for you to live and what you think you can do, understanding your own, and then where you want to do that, right? And what it looks like. So just a thought to share.
I want to thank you all for your comments. We have someone who works with museumexpert.org, Colleen Carter. And I'm going to ask Colleen if there was a question that came up that we didn't have panelists answer, and we'll give one last question here.
Sure. I think one that we could probably dive in just a little bit deeper on would be our DEAI issues, and how have our panelists really been making specific changes, either in front of the house, with visitors in their community, or directly with staff to make things more equitable and accessible and inclusive.
I'll talk about one thing behind the scenes that we did. We created a position around culture and community, and specifically did not include it as DEAI as an approach to this. One of the things that I recognize that in organizations, and maybe some of you agree, it's as soon as you put a label on a position, it automatically silos that position. Now that can be good and bad. The good part of it is there's somebody to go to. Whenever something goes wrong with the HVAC system, you can pick up the phone and call that person and say it's too hot or too cold in my office. Accountability is another thing, that you can have a position designed in such a way that both the responsibility and the accountability for those roles are in the same position. The question is, what happens to accountability and responsibility with DEAI issues if it's somehow just the responsibility of one person that has that in their title? And that's where I think it gets challenging. You can say this about anything, whether marketing. How do you build a culture of philanthropy if it's just involved in one department? You can't do that. Everybody's got to own that. So I think there needs to be more work about how we integrate these things into our culture and go beyond the labels. I remember Bert used to always say, STEM was the best thing and the worst thing that happened to science, technology, engineering, and math, because now you can just throw anything in a bucket, and as long as you're doing robots, you're doing STEM. But I think we forget that there's more to it. And sometimes each one of those elements, although they get lumped together, your organization might have problems really just with inclusion. That is, in terms of the hierarchy of where you're structured, that would make it difficult for people irrespective of their background. And other things might be more diversity of, sort of cognitive diversity of thought, as well as diversity of background and ethnicity, or maybe socioeconomic class within your organization. And when you can't bring all that into your organization, are you working with, how do you say this, focus groups? Or do you have advisory councils or groups that you work with, or maybe a partner organization that brings in, as Cindy was saying, if you can't afford to hire somebody that's an MSW, maybe you're working with an organization that has 3 of them, and they help you with this kind of thing as a fellow nonprofit. So I think we're going to have to mix and match and come up with a lot of different ways in which we plug things together so that the commitment is not just on one person to solve everything, like the CEO or a leader here or somebody in HR, but that we all embrace these concepts because we know it's the best way for our organization to function, not only internally, but also externally interfacing with our communities.
I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you for that answer, Christian. I'd like to introduce Walter Stabulos, who many of you know here, to talk about museumexpert.org and what next steps the organization is taking. Walter?
Thank you, Barry, and thanks for being the moderator of this conversation that we had so high expectations for, and it lived really up to that expectation, I must say. I think that everybody's going to be agreeing with me on that. And also thanks to the speakers, because they have been so candid in their answers and so transparent in a way that it's rarely seen in public debates, I would say, and I really appreciate the way that they have been doing that. And then thanks particularly to Christian to say that Museum Expert is one of the platforms where these conversations can happen, and that was, of course, our intention with that. And I don't have a lot of time, but Museum Expert initially has been a platform to connect people out of work with employers who might have some opportunities for them. So for those out there who have not enrolled yet on this platform, please do so. If you have opportunities for people, don't hesitate to go to the website and do the search for people. We try to improve our website every day as much as possible to respond to the challenge that still has. But moving forward, for us, this is not an endpoint. We have started with connecting people through this platform, and then we have included in the offers that we have made tools for people out of work to improve their capacity to get back to work. And with direct tools such as how you work on your resume and how do you go for an interview and things like that, but also by bringing to them what the conversations are that happening today in the museum field. And this was one of these conversations. And I think it's very clear for those who followed us that changes have happened, and that changes mean that people who are out of work now need to adapt to these changes as well, and not necessarily think that they would just go back into the field the way they were before. Changes need to be made. And so we will in the future probably create some new tools to help people responding to these new challenges. And we certainly will do that. Very practically, for those who are members of a Museum Expert, we will have a happy hour in 2 weeks about this. And how did you feel about what these CEOs and these directors of museums have said? How do you feel about that? What do you think you should do to respond to the challenges that they have put in front of you? So that's going to happen in 2 weeks. After that, and again with the National Girls Collaborative Project, we have another webinar where we will feature people who worked in museums and have made a move to other parts of the economy and learn from them how they did that, what the kind of skills they had that they found were useful in other parts of the economy, and then see how everybody is able to do that or not, and what you should look for when you step out of the non-for-profit world to the for-profit world, for example. And then finally, a bigger project is that we want to create a follow-up on this in a more in a focus group style, longer term, and inviting not only museum people, but it has been said and shown earlier that we need to look at how the economy is going, how is the work changing in general in society, what are changes that happen outside of the museums that impose to us new practices for ourselves. So we're going to create a focus group and invite certainly most of you to join into that. And hopefully this will give us new ideas for further action that we can take to support people out of work, and through that, the field in general. Thank you so much.
I want to thank all of our panelists today and the great conversation. And I want to welcome all of our guests to future webinars, the happy hour, and everything that Walter just mentioned for the next iteration of vigorous discussion. Thank you all. I hope you have a good day and hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.